folks, welcome. My name is Zach Finn, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Seward House Museum. And I have been excited for this presentation since we started planning it. So in a little bit, I'll be joined by representatives from the Surratt House Museum, as well as the Dr. Samuel A. Mudd Museum. And today's focus is going to be the night of April 14th. Of course, the assassination, conspiracy, and attempt that'll see William Henry Seward, who we can see to my right targeted, as well as the assassination of the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. And during this panel, we're going to talk about the buildup, the planning, the attack itself, and of course the aftermath in this really infamous night that comes following the conclusion of the American Civil War. But right now, before we break out into our panel discussion, we are standing in the Seward Family Library. For those of you who have been on a tour with us, you'll be familiar with this space. This is typically the second room we take you on throughout our tour. Now, this isn't normally where we introduce the assassination attempt. That comes out later in the tour after we've talked about the Civil War and the foreign policy and all the history that leads to the attack. But it's in this room where we really discuss the political trajectory of mostly William Henry Seward, but of course Lincoln as well, that leads to them being targets on the night of April 14, 1865. Now in this room, we talk about Seward's time as a New York State Senator, ultimately as the 12th governor of New York State, and of course his time as a United States Senator, which would see him become a very polarizing political figure, specifically in 1850, when he delivers his maiden speech on the floor of the Senate, arguing that there is a higher power than the Constitution when looking at the institution of slavery. Now, this is, of course, a very controversial speech during its time, very polarizing, but this speech thrusts Seward into the national spotlight. And for the 1850s and into the 1860s, Seward's never going to leave that national focus. Throughout his time as a United States Senator, he continues giving speeches, including one in Rochester, New York, where Seward predicts the tensions that will culminate in the American Civil War when he delivers the irrepressible conflict speech, arguing that the economic systems of both freedom and slavery can't coexist singularly in a nation. In many ways, he predicts the tensions that will culminate in the years to come. Now, as Seward is delivering the speech in Rochester, New York, he is once again eyeing a higher political office as he hopes to become the second Republican nominee to run for the presidency of the United States. And after Seward delivers this speech, he and his political advisor, Thurlow Weed, are so confident that he's going to get this nomination that Seward ends up traveling the world for a year, eventually returning to Auburn in March of 1860 as he waits to hear news from the Republican convention. And Seward is quite certain that he'll be the nominee. But of course, that's not what happened. He finds himself upset by Abraham Lincoln on the third ballot. And following that, their political trajectory becomes increasingly more intertwined. As before running against each other, we only have one documented account of them ever meeting. But following Seward's loss to Lincoln for the Republican candidacy, within 2 months, he's traveling throughout New York, throughout New England, and throughout the Midwest, stumping for this candidate who had just beaten him, hoping to rally the Republican Party behind its nominee. And this, of course, proved successful. Lincoln is elected the 16th President of the United States. And from there, Lincoln is convinced by Seward's political advisor, Thurlow Weed, to appoint Seward as his Secretary of State in the senior position of the cabinet, which will come to be referred to as the team of rivals. Now, when you visit us here at the Seward House Museum, after we do all this build-up, after we introduce these two political figures' trajectory, the collision in 1860, and ultimately their time working together during Lincoln's administration, we continue on. We talk about foreign policy during the Civil War. We talk about what life was like in Washington, D.C., but that's not going to be the focus today. We're focusing here on the aftermath, what ends up occurring on April 14th, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth makes his way to Ford's Theater and fires a single shot from his Derringer pistol behind the ear of President Abraham Lincoln. And at the same time, Seward is attacked by a former Confederate soldier, Lewis Powell. 5 people will be wounded in total in that attack, although everyone will survive. And kind of speaking to the violence and the grisliness of the attack on Seward, if you look to my left here, you're going to see one of the collection pieces, which I think for many of our visitors sticks with them after seeing this. This is going to be a bloody linen taken from Seward's bed on the night of the assassination attempt, stained with Seward's own blood. Now, we've got a lot to unpack when we talk about this story, so I'm going to disappear momentarily, and I'm going to make my way up to my office, and we'll introduce some of the other people who will be talking on the panel. But just a reminder, since this is a Facebook Live event, if you're watching now, feel free to include any questions that you have throughout the comments, and Maria, our Director of Development, will be monitoring those, and we'll be able to answer those throughout the talk today. So see you momentarily.
Thank you, Zach. Hopefully everyone is now able to see me up here in my office tower, 2 stories above Zach. And I'm equally delighted to be here with this great group today, moderating a panel discussion with Zach and then staff members from the Surratt House and the Dr. Samuel Mudd House. Zach's done a really nice job, I think, introducing what we do, who we are at the Seward House Museum in Auburn. I'm wondering, starting with you, Kobe, if you could introduce yourself and then give us a little background on your institution.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Kobe Treadway. I'm the education coordinator and temporarily the acting director at the Surratt House Museum. For those of you that don't know, the Surratt House Museum is located in Clinton, Maryland. It's about 12, 13 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And you're lucky I said Washington, D.C. there. I typically say Washington City because that's what it was called in the 1860s, and that's how I refer to it. So if you hear me say Washington City, I'm talking about D.C. The Surratt House is actually the home and business of the Surratt family. The Surratt family is known because Mary Surratt was actually part of the conspiracy behind the Lincoln assassination. And she was tried, found guilty, and was one of the conspirators executed by order of the federal government on July 7, 1865. That makes her the first woman to be executed by order of the federal government. So that story kind of kept the house alive, and that's where we focus our history. The site itself has a bit broader history than that, being that it was a tavern. It became a post office. It's where people from the Piscataway district in Prince George's County came to vote in 1860 for the Lincoln election. It also became a Confederate safe house. Prince George's County is in southern Maryland and was very pro-Confederate. And so the Southern agents would use the Surratt House as a place to stop en route between Washington and Richmond as they were taking information from one place to the other. So we have all kinds of stories to tell, and it's really at Surratt's Tavern where the plot begins to build initially for the kidnapping of Abraham Lincoln, and that's what bleeds into eventually becoming an assassination plan.
Thanks, Kobe. I think maybe I've already learned something. So is your understanding the official pronunciation Surratt, not Surratt? I think we say a lot of like rot, not rat, but it's Surratt?
Surratt.
All right, Zach, let's change the docent's manual here. We want to make sure we're saying it right. But thank you very much, Kobe. And Bob, we have you at the Mudd Museum. Would you mind introducing yourself and your museum for us?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Bob Bowser, and I'm currently the acting president of the Dr. Samuel A. Mudd Society. You can see behind me, it's not actually behind me, I wish it was. It's a beautiful southern Maryland day out there, but behind me on the screen, you can see the house known as St. Catherine. Dr. Samuel A. Mudd was a young, early 30s tobacco planter / doctor from southern Maryland who wound up getting himself involved with some rather seedy individuals, and ultimately is going to find himself playing host to Lincoln's killer the morning after the assassination. The house itself is located just a few miles outside of Waldorf, Maryland. We are about 12 miles south from where Kobe's sitting right now, so we're the next stop along the escape route if you've ever come down and taken a visit. We're about 25 miles from Washington, and it's at about 4:30 in the morning on April 15th that John Wilkes Booth and David Harold arrive in the yard right behind me and start frantically pounding on the front door searching for help. Over the course of the next day, Dr. Mudd is going to treat John Wilkes Booth's leg, and then Booth is going to rest in an upstairs bedroom in the house. All the while Mudd claiming that he didn't know the man who was in his house, yet he had met him at least twice before. And by the end of that day, towards evening, Booth and Harold are going to leave this property and are going to disappear into the Sakaya swamp only to reappear about 11 days later at the Garrett farm, where they are ultimately apprehended and killed.
Thanks so much, Bob. So Zach has taken some time to really unpack the assassination story through our lens. He's told it in rather an unusual place. He mentioned that the library is usually the second stop on the Seward House Museum tour. And for anybody watching who's not been, it's a great time of year to come up to Auburn and visit. We're a great house museum. Nearly everything inside is authentic and original to the generations of Seward family that have called this home from 1816 to the 1950s. The assassination story is usually almost sort of a climactic ending to a Seward House Museum tour. At various times, we've had entire exhibits built around it. A few years ago, we recreated Seward's Washington bedroom. And we sometimes even interpret sort of past 1865 and maybe interpret Alaska, 1867, Seward's Folly, the Purchase, and end up doing the assassination story near the end of every visitor's tour. And we've had visitors come back 10, 20, 30, 40 years after their last visit here. And the thing they most remember is that story, the bloody sheet. It's powerful, it's dramatic. And for many visitors, they're shocked. They know, or they think they know that story pretty well, at least vis-a-vis Lincoln and then Mudd and maybe even the Surratts. But the fact that Seward was entangled and nearly killed too is a shock to, I would say, 90, 95%. So for our visitors, that's sort of a powerful, almost sort of a gut punch on the tour. And it can be quite moving. I wonder if Kobe and then Bob, if you could each talk a bit about where, I know that mirror sites are largely geared around that story almost entirely exclusively, but there's interesting histories that you unpack beyond that. Just a bit more about sort of where that fits into your overall narrative, how you fold it into your visitor's experience, maybe. And if there's anything more that you want to say by way of sort of an abridged, here's how we interpret it, this would be a great time for us to sort of story share.
Yeah, so obviously the majority of our interpretation has to focus around the assassination. The building survived the urbanization of Clinton, Maryland because of that role. That history has been done really well. And so when I came in, my challenge was to actually start finding some of those other stories that we could unpack to add a little depth to the place. You know, I love the fact that we're doing this about Seward, because one of the things I like to talk about that kind of draws Seward into the picture is the fact that one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Mary was the fact that on the night she was arrested, Lewis Powell shows up at her house in Washington City. Federal agents are already there to arrest her. He knocks on the door, he shows up, and we kind of talk about this situation where Powell tries to pass himself off as a day worker for her, showing up well after normal calling hours, and the disbelief of the agents involved. They're both arrested, and it becomes William Bell identifying Powell that really starts to get them looking hardcore at Mary. In fact, it's probably what keeps her in prison until her execution. So that's a part of the story that I like to bring up a lot, because it does create those connections. You see it more from a national level, the far-reaching implications and effects of that assassination attempt. The other part that I like to try and bring into focus, speaking of William Bell, is a woman named Rachel Hawkins. On the side, Rachel was an enslaved individual, of course, free by 1865 because of Maryland's emancipation in 1864. And so she was actually a paid servant working at the tavern for John Lloyd, who was renting it from Mary. She testifies on behalf of Mary in her trial, and also John Surratt Jr., Mary's son, who's involved in the conspiracy, as a character witness. And there are two stories, William Bell and Rachel, I really find interesting because it gives us just a little bit of insight, and we really only know what's in the court transcripts and just what little's in the official records, but how the attack affected the lives of African-American individuals whose stories are still really kind of buried somewhere in the records. So, you know, one of the big things that I focus on with Rachel is the fact that during the trial, she really didn't say anything negative about Mary. And for a long time, the approach has been because she didn't, and that was her chance to do so. You know, she's in front of all these officers from the military tribunal. She's protected by the War Department at that time. This would be her chance, right? That's what everybody's like, this is her chance to say how she really feels about Mary. And instead, she's really upfront and simple. She was a good mistress. She fed Union troops when they came by. She said all of the right things to check the boxes so that when she would get home, she would be safe, or at least safer than she would have been had she said something negative about Mary. And so that's kind of trying to twist that narrative a little bit away from the obviously she loved Mary because she didn't say anything negative about her to, okay, what are the reasons that she might have? So I think those are some interesting dynamics to start diving into, to add a little bit more depth to what is already a very crucial and crazy interesting story.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kobe. Bob, would you weigh in as well, please?
Absolutely. At the Dr. Mudd House, we've been focusing a lot on really trying to step back and set a lot of context for our visitors when they come in. 13 years ago, when I started as a tour guide at the house, people would come to the house and they expected to hear that, Dr. Mudd opened this door to a stranger who we let in, and he fixed his leg, and the man left, and the next thing you know, the federal soldiers were here to arrest him. And there's a lot more to the story than that. Our story actually starts all the way back in November of 1864 with John Wilkes Booth coming down into southern Maryland. He's telling everybody he's looking for farmland to buy, but we know today that he's actually looking for help in this kidnapping plot that he has in his brain. And when he gets down into southern Maryland, he's introduced to Dr. Mudd. As a matter of fact, he's going to meet with him at St. Mary's Church in Bryantown, about 5 miles from the house. And on at least one occasion, quite possibly twice, the evidence points to him being back here in early December of 1864. And he even stays overnight at Dr. Mudd's house, goes next door to the Gardner farm and purchases the one-eyed horse that Lewis Powell is riding. See, I can try to get everybody connected here on the same page on assassination night. And then he's going to run into him again in Washington, D.C. a few days later, and he's going to make a very crucial introduction to John Wilkes Booth. He's going to introduce him to a man by the name of John Surratt, and thus Mary is going to be pulled into the story as well. Obviously, Dr. Mudd has his reasons for behind everything he did. He didn't, he'll tell you that he didn't believe that Booth was up to anything suspicious. As a matter of fact, he even claims that he apologized to John Surratt because he thought John Wilkes Booth was a Union spy trying to figure out if there was anybody disloyal in southern Maryland. So we really tried to start the story back in 1864 and build so that our guests have a chance to kind of take in the entire story. The goal is to try to provide a balanced experience at the house. Obviously, if you know anything about Dr. Mudd's story, he's very polarizing in the Lincoln assassination. There are people who think he was 100% guilty and the federal government completely railroaded him. And then there are people that think that there should have been 5 executions instead of 4 in July. And what our job at the house is really to try to help people understand the evidence that comes from both sides of those arguments. And I always tell my tours when they leave, I want them to walk out with more questions than when they came in, so that they can go out and interpret the history, and they can make their own judgments on what happened in the walls behind me in November through April 1865.
Zach, anything that you want to add on to Powell and how we interpret here?
Of course, and Jeff, I think you covered it great at the beginning. So one of the things that makes this such an important story when we have visitors stop at the Seward House Museum is they're quite familiar with the conspiracy. They're familiar with the aftermath. Of course, they're familiar with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But the fact that Seward is one of the targets that night, I think, is something that is, quite shocking to a lot of our visitors. And like Jeff mentioned, it's very much of a gut punch when you're in this space. We've had several different interpretations of the assassination over the past few years. But at the moment, we have it in the family drawing room. So it's this space that's constructed in 1866, so after the assassination attempt. But as they're designing it in the 1860s, this is supposed to be a family space. Seward is designing it with the idea that he, Fanny, and Frances, his daughter and his wife, will be able to eventually retire to this space and plan out world trips. It's very much a family space, one of entertainment. And when you visit it, you see portraits of all the family members. Seward's parents, we used to have a statue of Francis in there. You see portraits of the next generation. And of course, when we're telling this assassination story, the family, almost all of them, bear witness to the attack. Of course, Seward is targeted that night. He'll be significantly wounded. His second oldest son, Frederick, is bludgeoned so significantly over the head by Lewis Powell's pistol that after the attack, he's in a daze walking around the scene of the attack, saying repeatedly, "It is, it is." And Dr. Verdi, who's attending to the family, has to ask the question for him as Frederick's trying to say, is my skull broken, which is in fact the case. So we have this portrait of Frederick Seward. Of course, Gus Seward, Seward's oldest son, eventually helps get Lewis Powell out of the room. So in our current interpretation in the drawing room, I think it becomes much more of a somber story. When we told it upstairs, we had this room designed to look kind of like Seward's bedroom would have in the Lafayette Square mansion. We called it the Washington, D.C. room, so very Spartanly decorated. We had some images of Lewis Powell, kind of to frame our story. But now when we tell it in the family space and we tie in all of these stories, Fanny Seward, who is beside her father, reading The Legend of Charlemagne, as she writes in her journal, and she hears her brother and Lewis Powell get into a fight, just becomes a very moving moment in that space, and it's very much a gut punch. So I would say that's been our biggest change in interpretation, is reframing it in the house. And of course, looking to include Fanny Seward's voice a little bit more. Much of what we know about the attack is thanks to the testimony of William Bell, who Kobe has mentioned, whose testimony is used to identify Lewis Powell, is very influential in helping find Powell and identify him. But also Fanny Seward's journal. Fanny was the Seward's youngest daughter. She was an aspiring author and playwright. And 3 weeks after the attack happens, after bearing witness to it, she writes a pretty lengthy journal entry about how she remembers the attack. And I think at this current moment, we're looking to include Fanny Seward much more frequently throughout the interpretation, using the fact that, as Lewis Powell is bludgeoning Frederick Seward's head with a revolver, Fanny Seward is beside her father reading, and she writes that she hears the attack, but it's so distant and she doesn't think it's happening. So her assumption is it's a family servant chasing after a mouse or rat with a broom. So just using Fanny Seward's voice to kind of frame the attack and explain some of the details a little bit more.
Thank you, Zach. And this is a nice chance, this is a nice setup for me to ask questions of Kobe and Bob again about how their own interpretations have evolved. But before I do, I want to give both of them the chance to be thinking about questions that they might want to put out to each other, to us, and of course, everybody watching this on live stream. Please feel free to ask any questions in the comments. We do want to save some time at the end, and everybody here is happy to answer your questions directly. Zach's talked a bit about how our own interpretation of the assassination story tends to change year to year. It seems mostly we change it based on themes we're emphasizing in a given year, or where in the house we are doing the interpretation. This year, the story lends itself so much to bringing in the whole family dynamic. I wonder, Kobe and Bob, and Kobe, maybe you would go first. How has your interpretation been challenged or changed over the years? New evidence or new historiography, new scholarship, new thinking on your part? Is it? I'm sure it's not a static story, but I'm interested to hear how the story changes for you at any given moment, and even in your institutional planning. And Kobe, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely not a static story. It's a little bit, I guess, it's different for us than it is for you guys, because the whole house focuses on the assassination story. But one of the bigger changes that we've taken on is sort of like over at MUDS, where we're kind of building up the backstory so that people can understand why the Surratts might have involved themselves in the Confederate cause. Why did they play the role that they did? Why did they use their house as a safe house? The other thing is, Mary's a very controversial figure, much like Dr. Mudd. We have visitors come in, and this is probably the one big challenge that I deal with. I always start my tour saying, I am never going to flat out say one way or the other whether or not I think Mary was guilty or innocent, involved or not. I'm just going to present to you what I know and let you make your mind up. But they're always like, by the end of the tour, it becomes pretty clear which way I lean. And so that can always bring up that difficult discussion, because a lot of people will swear up and down that Mary was innocent, that she had no involvement, or what little she did was to protect her son. And so one of the focuses that I have is to try and present the evidence against Mary in a very clinical way. And it's really hard because it's such a personal story, that to approach it dispassionately. Do I think Mary deserved to be hanged? Probably not. She didn't physically hurt anybody, but maybe she could have spent the rest of her time in prison, or received the same sentence that Mudd received. So building that backstory and then dealing with the challenges of Mary was innocent and it was a horrible travesty of justice or injustice, are the big things. The backstory is really interesting. Mary has taken on sort of this role where with certain crowds, she's almost like untouchable. But one of the things that I find really interesting is that there was an interview done with people throughout the county that knew her not long after her execution. And one farmer made the comment that everybody talks of Miss Surratt like she was a saint, but she had an inappropriate relationship with a Catholic priest while her husband was still alive. And that's it. There's no more detail on it. But so it brings up this thing that I like to really drive home, is that these are just people. And so when we do our interpretation, I'm trying to change it more from that assassination story to an understanding and digging into the minds of people. People are put in difficult situations and they make difficult choices all the time. And as one of my docents likes to say, Mary played a really hard game and she lost. And so it's trying to reconcile all these good things that people know about Mary with where she is now, in 1865 under arrest and facing trial and execution for the Lincoln assassination. So those are the complexities and the complications that we generally face at Surratt House. But I embrace them because it always brings up great discussions.
Kobe, if I might follow up, do you think some of the passion that you see coming in from your visitors who are determined, maybe even before hearing your clinical evidence, they've come in either with their minds made up, they've done the research, or they haven't, is it tied to the same sentiments we see that are polarizing over Confederate memorials and arguments about the true causus belli, Civil War, slavery versus a war of union? Do you think that's the reason that especially being located where you are, still sort of on this cusp of right in the middle ground, the border space between North and South from the Civil War, and now this has led into a culture wars conversation. Is that the reason you think it is still such a touchy subject today?
I do. I think it's hard to get away from it. One of the reasons that I like to point out that one interview with the farmer is so much effort was put into building Mary up into this certain character, and it's very similar to what you see with the buildup of the Lost Cause myth and the Good South and these things. So I think it's a big part of it. Usually we have two kinds of visitors that come in. We have some who know just a little bit and they want to learn more, and then we have those people who've really done the research, and they come in feeling very specifically one way or the other about Mary. And it becomes pretty obvious in quick discussion with them. For some people, it's really hard to hear the other perception of Mary and her role. And I do think a lot of it stems from the same thing that most of the other antebellum sites are dealing with throughout the country.
Thanks, Kobe. Bob, I'll bounce it to you. Same questions.
Sure. So we're very, very similar to what Kobe's doing at the Surratt House. I've always looked at Mary and Dr. Mudd as probably the two biggest pop culture icons to come out of the Lincoln assassination. They're the ones that they make movies about. They're the ones that are written about the most. And like we mentioned, people are, it almost seems like there's a pendulum. It's either all one way or all the other with both of them. And in reality, the truth is that it's somewhere right in the middle, in that hazy gray space of involvement versus lack of involvement. We've been focusing a lot over the last few years down at our site at what I like to call microhistory. So we know our big story and we know our controversy, and we know how to handle that in the tours. But what we didn't focus a lot on was who else was on this farm? What else was happening? How would they have been involved in this? And we did some research and found out that on the morning after the assassination, when John Wilkes Booth walked through that door, there were at least 17 people living on this farm of all different races, of all different classes in society. And we only really, and a lot of this has to do with just our wish to try to keep the tour around an hour. A lot of that, I think, has been overlooked in the past, and we're now trying to infuse that in because there are some really great micro stories here. Before it used to be that Dr. Mudd went out and he found these two men in his front yard and he invited them in to help them out, and the story went on from there. Well, what we don't know is that he actually went into the house. He walked down to the little out kitchen, which is over my shoulder. You can see the smallest part of the house, which actually had a family of African Americans, one of which who had at one time belonged to Dr. Mudd in there, and two other young ladies, one about 12 years old and her half sister that was about 8, that lived in there in a loft above that tiny space. And he had one of the young ladies start breakfast because he had these men in his house, and he got his hired hand, Frank Washington, up and had him go out and grab the horses and put them in the stable. Frank Washington's ultimately going to be taken up to Washington. He's going to spend about 6 weeks in the old Capitol prison waiting to testify on Dr. Mudd's behalf, and he will. But their stories weren't being told before. And so what we're doing now is we're really focusing on okay, who was here? And when you start looking at kind of the years of the Civil War, so 1860 to 1865, that's right when the house it's being completed. The two ends of the house are built in 1859, and the middle part is added on in 1864. The Mudds were an enslavement family that owned slaves. They used slave labor to farm 200 acres of tobacco. And then when emancipation hit, many of them chose to leave. And so we're trying to dig in and find their stories. Several of them testify on Dr. Mudd's behalf in the trial, and then several of them testify against Dr. Mudd in the trial. And it's kind of neat. I mean, living on our farm were people who were some of the first African Americans who were allowed to testify against a former enslaver in the history of this country. And looking at their stories and their motives and what they're saying is just very, very fascinating. And they tell us so much about the farm. Little things that we've never even thought to look of before. Where were the outbuildings? Where were they planting the tobacco versus the corn and the wheat? What kind of animals were here? What did the daily schedule look like? How did people interact, or how did people not interact on the farm? And all of those little micro histories are helping us create the big macro history, so we can give ourselves and our visitors a much fuller representation of what it would have been like to live on that farm in 1865. And it's really been fascinating and a lot of fun. And in the next year or so, I think we're going to have a few really fascinating things start to happen at the house that'll really, I think, people will really enjoy.
Thanks, Bob. Both great answers. I'm interested to think about this micro approach and the voices you're reclaiming. And Zach has talked about how we likewise try to do maybe not a micro history, but a social history through the family. And Kobe's great points about how they walk this line and present a case, trying to be sometimes dispassionate when passions run hot, and discussing Surratt's criminality. Zach, I wonder if you might talk a bit about either of those things, how we tend to do social history. It doesn't come up as much here, I think, as in Maryland, about Powell and how we should, it's hard to judge someone 150 years later, but of his own background. People ask us, what kind of man was Lewis Powell? What was he thinking? Why did he do it? Maybe those are some questions, Zach, you wouldn't mind answering for us.
Of course. So for our assassination story, it is different than looking at Surratt or looking at Dr. Mudd, because it is very clear that Lewis Powell is, of course, guilty. He is apprehended when he returns to Mary Surratt's boarding house, as Kobe mentioned. I think it was, well after calling hours, around 11 p.m., pretending to be a farmhand or a day laborer, and he's quickly apprehended. And then throughout the committee that tries him sentenced to execution. So it is a very difficult story to tell. In the past, when we had the Washington, D.C. bedroom, so set up like the Washington, D.C. bedroom Seward would have stayed at in the Lafayette Square mansion, set up to look like it would have looked like on the night of the attack. There's these truly haunting images that our visitors would see when they walked into the space. The first is a colorized image of Lewis Powell as he's aboard the ship where he would be held in between the trial and the execution. It's colorized by a later German historian, but it is an image of Lewis Powell. And when our visitors walk in, if they haven't seen him before, it's, you know, truly a haunting image. He looks very modern. So he has kind of a modern hairstyle. So people immediately think it's a reenactor posing as Lewis Powell. So you have this image of Powell wearing the Navy suit with the cuffs ripped off. So you see this image of Powell himself. And then beside it is going to be a scene from the execution where he will be hung alongside Mary Surratt, George Surratt, and Dr. Harold and David Harold. So this image of the execution and of Lewis Powell in life are, you know, very contrasting to each other. And I think those evoke a lot of feelings when our visitors make their way into this space. So kind of that, you know, line we have to balance as we do the interpretation is making sure that Lewis Powell isn't this boogeyman that appears on the night of April 14th and is then sentenced to execution. You know, you see the picture of him, you see the execution, and it's a tough line to walk because he does take such a radical approach. But like Kobe mentioned earlier, these are, you know, real people placed in tough situations. Lewis Powell had been radicalized, you know, from his younger years. He was familiar with the institution of slavery, ends up serving during the Civil War. I think only one of his four, one of his parents' four sons ends up surviving the Civil War. And the son who survives ends up losing a leg, to the best of our knowledge. So this is a family that is, you know, significantly impacted by the conflict. So it's always, you know, how do we balance having Lewis Powell show up in the story when he's responsible for such carnage and, you know, an attack that sees Frederick Seward bludgeoned so significantly over the head that his skull is exposed. Seward attacked with a Bowie knife, leading to permanent disfigurement. George Robinson, a military medic, will be stabbed in the forehead, though he'll survive. There's a delivery boy who's stabbed. Gus, Seward's oldest son, is stabbed as well. So just a immense scene of violence. And, you know, how do we tell the story with the image of Lewis Powell behind you, with the execution? It's a very fine line to walk, but I think, you know, when you tell the story of the assassination attempt, including a little bit of Lewis Powell's background, including, you know, the argument that is made for him in the trial by Doster, who ends up defending him, where he claims that essentially Lewis Powell is guilty or is suffering from moral insanity, that he's suffering from these delusions that this assassination attempt on Seward will turn him into a war hero, kind of help frames Powell's experience within the broader assassination story and kind of allows us to work from this micro history to a macro history. And ultimately, although Seward survived the attack, allows us to kind of expand to those same tensions that you would see during Reconstruction that Seward is part of as he continues on as Secretary of State in the Johnson administration.
We're still waiting for more questions to come in. Thank you, Zach, by the way, for more questions to come in from people who are watching right now. I want to sort of, in the spirit of that, ask everybody here to talk about some commonly asked questions that they receive from their on-site visitors. And while you're maybe thinking about those, if there are questions that you want to put to other panelists, everyone, please feel free to do that. But starting with you, Kobe, what are some of the most frequently asked questions that visitors bring with them or that crop up along the course of hearing the stories that you tell? Thank you.
So, I mean, the obvious one was Mary involved? That's probably the most commonly asked, frequently asked question. And I've given you most of my answer, how we approach it previously, but another question that I really find fascinating to delve into that gets asked a lot is, was the Confederate government behind the assassination attempt? You know, that was a theory even in 1865. And when you look at Stanton's approach to the investigation and everything else, you know, he's operating on this idea that it is the Confederate government involved behind it. And something that I find interesting to do is to really look at all of the connections that tie Confederate agents to the conspirators. I mean, besides the fact that John Surratt Jr. Was the linchpin, the link piece between Booth's group of conspirators and the Confederate government, because he's an agent working for Judah Benjamin. You know, the complexity of the attack and who they targeted shows some level of understanding of how the federal government was supposed to work. And Judah Benjamin was a lawyer, a constitutional lawyer. He knew how that worked. So there's this argument that gets put forth that it was Judah Benjamin behind the development of the attack. And when you start to look at all of the different links, John Mosby's raiders coming down to create distractions right around April 13th or 12th. There's a lot of connections that's hard to ignore that point to some kind of involvement by the Confederate government. And, you know, which also brings up the point that targeting leadership on either side was nothing new. You know, there's the assassination plot against Davis that Dahlgren tries to carry out. You know, he's killed when his cavalry patrol gets ambushed, and he's got the paperwork on his body about the mission that he's on. So, you know, by 1864-65, that war is a grueling. I mean, it's you can't even imagine what it must have been like for the population at that time. And I think, you know, we've left behind the traditional narratives of what's fair play in warfare. And I think so you can make an argument for the Confederate government being behind it. So that's a question that gets asked a lot. And I know I went off on a tangent there, but because that question does bring up so many different aspects of the time period. So I like to delve into that one.
Great question. I'm glad to have that answer personally and for future visitation here. Bob, I want to give you the same question about commonly asked questions. And also, I don't want to forget that you had some slides you wanted to share. I don't want to forget to give you the chance to show us some pictures of your museum if you want to do that now or a bit later. We've got about 15 minutes left before we wind down. So just to put that out there, Bob, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll wait until we get towards the end to show them. It's just sort of a little display of some of the hot spots in the tour. So we'll tease the viewers a little bit more with that. Obviously, the number one question that we get asked at the Dr. Mudd Museum is the exact same one that Kobe mentioned, is was Dr. Mudd guilty? And that is a really complex and fun answer to get into. I don't have the 4 hours that it would probably take to do it right now. But the second most popular one, and I can get into this one a little bit, would be, why was Dr. Mudd arrested for doing his Hippocratic Oath? So I would say more than half of our visitors come in, and that is a question that they have. The man was a doctor. He helped an injured individual. Why was he arrested for that? And the answer is that Dr. Mudd wasn't arrested for carrying out his Hippocratic Oath. The federal government arrested Dr. Mudd because they felt that he knew who the individual was that was in his house and then purposely tried to buy time for the assassin. So Dr. Mudd really falls into that second charge of aiding and abetting the assassin after the fact. And so we like to clear that up right at the very beginning. If you go through the hundreds of pages of the trial testimony, that is not even a ploy that Thomas Ewing, Dr. Mudd's attorney, a very skilled attorney, by the way, he doesn't even attempt it. The words Hippocratic and Oath do not even appear in the trial transcripts. And so I like to get that, we like to point that out, that he was actually, you know, he was arrested for what the government felt was aiding and abetting after the fact. And we also like to point out too that when he was arrested, he was somebody that the government was holding under suspicion. However, he was not immediately taken to the monitors and put on board the monitors like Atzerodt and Harold and Powell had been. He was actually put in the old Capitol prison and spent some time in there with Mary. And it's not until May 4th that Dr. Mudd is going to be transferred from the penitentiary, from the old Capitol prison down to the Arsenal Penitentiary to await trial. He's the last of the assassins to arrive there, or of the conspirators to arrive there. And a lot of that hinges on what Dr. Mudd didn't say in some of the interviews that he had. If you read the two statements that are attributed to him, one signed and one kind of written up for him, he does. He admits to knowing John Wilkes Booth. He admits to having him in his house in November of 1864. What he does not say in those interviews is he does not mention the meeting in December of 1865 or 1864 in Washington, where he introduces Booth to John Surratt, and that's ultimately what gets him taken out of the old Capitol prison and put into the old Washington Arsenal Penitentiary. It's the testimony of a young man named Louis Weichman, who really is going to be the death knell in Mary's coffin, and he certainly doesn't do a lot for Dr. Mudd's case. Where he comes out, he was at that meeting. He was with John Surratt whenever Dr. Mudd saw him in the street, flagged him down, and they all went back to the National to smoke cigars and have fine drinks and discuss things, depending on who you want to hear from on that one. So pointing that out to visitors and sort of clarifying, why the federal government actually took Dr. Mudd. It wasn't, just because he had treated his leg and then they unfairly took him away. It was that they felt, rightly or wrongly, I let them decide, they felt that Dr. Mudd had information that he did not come forward with at that critical moment, and Booth was able to escape at that point.
Thanks, Bob. And good news, everybody. We do have some questions coming in. Zach, before we get to them, I want to give you a chance to follow up and have sort of last voice here. But one viewer who came in a bit late asked if everybody could do a brief reintroduction. So we'll just go in the usual order of Kobe, Bob, Zach, but I'm moderating this panel discussion. I am Jeff Ludwig, the Director of Education at the Seward House Museum.
And I am Kobe Treadway, the Education Coordinator and Acting Director at the Surratt House Museum.
I am Bob Bowser, and I am the Acting President of the Dr. Samuel A. Mudd Society.
And I'm Zach Finn. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Surratt House Museum. And Jeff, to your question about some commonly asked questions regarding the assassination attempt, I think the first, kind of big general question we get is, why is Seward targeted? He's not third in line to receive the presidency. Should Ezra carry out his original intended purpose to assassinate Vice President Johnson? And should John Wilkes Booth succeed in assassinating Abraham Lincoln? So he's not third in line to receive the presidency should the other two perish. And I think, it's a long question to answer that we try to answer throughout the tour. Seward's a rather radical political figure certainly throughout the 1940s when he's governor of New York, but also throughout his time as a United States Senator in the 1850s. He gives the irrepressible conflict speech. He gives the higher law speech. Seward's a very polarizing and progressive political figure when you're looking at the 19th century. So of course, he's already kind of a natural target for John Wilkes Booth and the other conspirators. But something Kobe mentioned earlier that I had forgotten to speak to, political violence was just ramping up throughout the 1850s and 1860s. On a national level, leading up to the war, you have the caning of Charles Sumner by Philip Brooks. Political violence was becoming much more accepted there's a better word for it, but I'll say accepted. And on a micro level, you see the Seward family constantly coming throughout under attack throughout the 1850s. They have 2 dogs poisoned throughout this time. There's an arson attack. The original barn and carriage are burned down in 1859. So it's a long way to answer the question, but Seward's a natural target because he'd already been targeted due to his beliefs. You see, political rhetoric on violence ramping up throughout the 1850s, and throughout the 1860s, Seward and Lincoln are working so closely together that, Seward is believed by many to kind of be a significant influence on the president. So that's one of the reasons that Seward finds himself targeted on April 14th. Another statement which Jeff alluded to earlier, which isn't really a question, again, more of a statement, but most of our visitors say something along the lines of they can't believe they hadn't heard, Seward had someone sent out to kill him that night. It's kind of, tucked away in the national narrative. And then a morbid counterfactual history, which we have pop up occasionally, is visitors will ask, what do we think would have happened if Seward had died that night? How different would our tour have been? What would the museum have been like? And that's a really interesting and tricky question to answer. Seward, after surviving the assassination attempt, goes on to serve in the Johnson administration. And during this time, his national popularity kind of takes a hit because he's so closely aligned with a very unpopular president. Even his political advisor, Thurlow Weed, who had been there with him from the beginning, has this quote when asked about Seward running for the presidency in the future towards the end of his political career. And he basically says Seward is one of the most unpopular people in the country at this time. So it's interesting to think about how different Seward's political legacy would have been, maybe not now in the 21st century when there's, so much scholarly work dedicated to his career and we're starting to see some more nuanced interpretations of it. But what Seward's legacy would have been like, in the late 19th century. I think that's where you would see the most significant change in where Seward is interpreted had he passed away because of the assassination attempt. I think you would have seen a little bit more of that reverence as a martyr that you see with Lincoln during this period, and certainly in the 20th and eventually in the 21st century. But I don't think it would have influenced the way Seward is interpreted in the 21st century, just because there's been so much scholarship dedicated to him, and you really start to see a more nuanced and fleshed out interpretation of his career.
Thank you, Zach. We have some good questions coming in, and right now it looks like I have one for everybody. How convenient is that? So I'm not going to go in the order in which they were asked. I'm going to keep going in our panel order. We have a nice working rhythm here. So first one, Kobe, question is going to be for you, and it's from a Mr. Russell Andrew. The mention of Mary Surratt having an inappropriate relationship with a Catholic priest was very interesting. Were there any other items from the post-execution interviews with Mary Surratt's, I'm saying Surratt wrong again, Mary Surratt's neighbors that Kobe might have found interesting and that Kobe might tell us about?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, that one is the biggest bombshell. Most of the other interviews are, Mary was a gentle woman. She was a kind woman. She was devout. Nobody really had any issues or complaints about her. So if that's what makes that other one stand out so much, is because it is so different from most accounts of Mary from the people around her. The story itself is really fascinating. Mary was a devout Catholic. She wasn't born Catholic. She was sent to Catholic school when she was a child. So that in itself is a really cool story, because we're talking about a woman in the mid-19th century actually getting a very good education. Her mother ensured that both Mary and her sister were properly educated. But while she was in this Catholic school, she converted at the age of 12. So obviously the Catholic religion meant a lot to her. But once she and her husband, John Surratt Sr., moved out to what is now Clinton, she was really isolated away from the church. And so she made contact with the Catholic priest who was operating out of Alexandria, and who was also assigned to Southern Maryland, named Joseph Noddy. And he's from Italy. And that's who she seems to have struck this relationship with. What's really interesting is hearing the report from the neighbor, and then finding a couple of Mary's letters written to Finati after he had been sent away. Now, why was he sent away? He was sent to Boston because the church hierarchy heard rumors of an inappropriate relationship between him and Mary. So he was shipped off, and Mary sent letters to him. And in these letters, if you start to read between the lines, you almost get the sense that there was definitely something between them. Whether or not it was physical, we don't know, but there's definitely an emotional connection. So there seems to be some truth to these rumors that are floating around. And that's the cool stuff, because it really paints all of these figures that we know from pictures of history as real people, making choices every day that are that could define them. So while the neighbors don't tell us a lot interesting other than the one particular, we do have some cool things that help build that story up.
Thank you, Kobe. Bob, this one's going to be for you. It's from Mr. Hal Lewis. Is it true that his name is Mudd is because of Dr. Samuel Mudd?
All right. I should have mentioned that too in our most frequently asked questions, because that one comes up right after the why was he arrested for his Hippocratic oath. So excellent question. The answer to that is no. We found evidence as far back as I believe the 1840s in some manuals, some language manuals in England, about the phrase "your name is Mudd," lowercase m, single d, being used to talk about somebody whose reputation had been tarnished. However, we certainly, I think, have stepped in and made it famous, because it's transformed from your name was lowercase 1d to now your name was uppercase 2ds. And it almost comes out to be like a bumper sticker slogan now, if you think about it for us, that people recognize it from there. And I actually did some research into it, and one of the things that I found interesting was early on there was a reference. There was one reference made, a little like haiku poem that showed up in a newspaper, talking about boots having mud, M-U-D-D, on them. But for the most part, in the time period where Dr. Mudd is really in the spotlight, so throughout the trial, throughout his time in prison, and then shortly after his arrival home, you heard people talking about the situation being as clear as mud. And that, in the period, seems to be the reference that the people went with. And then somewhere, it seems like probably in the 1970s, the first book came out. His name was Mudd. It was very pro Dr. Mudd. And then in the 90s, Ed Steers came out with a book called His Name is Still Mudd, which is a counter to that. And that has certainly just elevated it in the national sort of popular spotlight. So I guess we'll take it as our very own slogan, although we didn't come up with it.
That's a great question and a great answer. Zach, last question is going to go to you. I'm going to read it aloud. This is from Mr. Steve Kopp. Zach, can you talk about when Seward realized Lincoln was killed, and talk about how the injuries from his carriage accident may have helped save him from Powell's knife? So it's a two-part question for you, Zach.
Of course. So there's actually two interpretations about how Seward finds out that Lincoln had passed. The first, I believe it's in Fanny's journal entry, that she mentions that her mother, so Frances Seward, comes to the recovering Seward and informs him that President Lincoln is dead, and that Seward bears this news quite stoically, quite quietly, and to himself. The other interpretation comes, and I had cheated, I looked ahead to the question to make sure I could answer it, comes from a news report from the New York Tribunal on April 20th, where it talks about how while recovering, Seward had asked that his bed be brought closer to the window, and that a family servant making his way into the house to check in on Seward, sees Seward staring out the window and looking at the half-mast flag. The family servant asks him what's wrong, is there anything that he can do for him? And Seward responds, the president is dead. And when the family servant kind of follows up in conversation, Seward says that, had the president still been alive, he would have visited him by now. So we get two different interpretations. I think both kind of speak to Seward and Lincoln's relationship, and kind of tying perfectly into the first part of your question, or second part, relating to the carriage accident. Lincoln did visit Seward shortly after the carriage accident, 9 days before the attack, which would see him suffer a bilateral fracture of his jaw, a broken collarbone. Seward was in such bad shape that the whole family descends on Washington, D.C. to be with him because they're concerned it might be the last chance they have to see him alive. So while recovering, Frances Seward, his wife, who was suffering from some health ailments of her own, makes the trip, and they all gather around Seward in Washington, D.C. to help him heal during this process. As for the extent of the injuries and how it helps Seward survive, or leads to Seward surviving the attack against Lewis Powell, it's difficult to answer that 100%. When we're looking at the story of the assassination, there's a lot of, not necessarily rumors, but it's such a chaotic scene, and the aftermath, whether it's newspapers, whether it's people close to the family, you see a lot of potentially misinformation being published. And then in the future, when historians are researching it, they'll take that misinformation and they'll continue to kind of allow it to snowball in narration. So one of those early pieces that appears to our best knowledge to be misinformation is that when Seward is injured in the carriage accident, he ends up receiving a metal brace to help support his neck and his healing jaw. And kind of the way the story goes from that point is when Lewis Powell attacks him and he's slashing at his face with the Bowie knife, it's actually the metal brace that helps Seward survive. But to the best of our knowledge, it doesn't look like on the night of the attack Seward was wearing that brace. However, his neck was propped in a way that it made it very difficult for Lewis Powell to land a killing blow. He likely had gauze and padding around his jaw as well, so that surely played a role in it. I think one of the most important things, or one of the most critical components that leads to Seward surviving the attack, is just what a chaotic scene that night was. It is so chaotic that when Lewis Powell is being forced out of the room by Gus Seward and George Robinson, Frances Seward kind of stumbles upon the scene at the very end of it, and she thinks that's what's happening, is that Seward is basically from suffering from the carriage accident, that he doesn't realize who people are, and that it's actually Seward attacking people, and that what she's witnessing is her son Gus Seward trying to restrain her husband from attacking George Robinson. And it's just such a chaotic scene, and you see that trickle into the way it's reported, and that's why you see some of those some of that misinformation kind of carry on even into modern historical interpretations, such as the neck brace playing a role into Seward surviving the attack.
Thank you, Zach. This has been a wonderful and illuminating hour. I want to go through with each of you one last time for any concluding remarks you might like to share. Bob, I know you've got some pictures. Zach, and other questions come in that you can maybe address when you close, which is there any way that the carriage accident could be considered an assassination attempt? But I also would like it if each of you could let us know what's the best way for people out there who want to visit your museum to do that. What information do they need to have? Website, following you on social media, what should they do? Anything to sort of follow up from this. So how can they visit you? What do they need to know? And then any closing remarks you'd care to share with us. I'm going to close out mine right now. And again, thanks to all three of you for coming, and thanks to everyone who's watching. And Kobe, we're going to start with you first, as always.
All right. First, I just want to say thanks to Jeff for moderating, and to Zach for reaching out and getting this thing worked out. This has been a lot of fun. It's always great to talk history with other fellow historians. So it hasn't happened as much as I would like. As far as visiting Surratt House Museum, we are still currently closed. However, we are looking at an opening date towards the end of October. So once that has been official, we will put it up on our Facebook page. If you want other information about us, there's the Surratt Society page. That's our friends group. You can find that at Surratt Museum. Just Google search that and it'll get you right to the page. You can also, like I said, look at our Facebook page. Those are our big ways. PG Parks History on Facebook is also a good way to see what's going on, not just with the Surratt's House Museum, but other museums that are tied in with Maryland National Park and Planning Commission, which is our umbrella organization. So we have lots of good historic sites. As far as if you want to do any independent research, I always recommend starting off with James Swanson's Manhunt. It reads real fast. It's a good introduction, and then you can start to dig a little deeper. Ed Steer's book is really good, Blood on the Moon, and then American Brutus. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So those are the three books I'd recommend you start with. And just remember, keep an open mind and analyze everything.
All right. First, Jeff and Zach, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. And Kobe, thank you for making the arrangements to make it happen. This has been a lot of fun. I hope we can do it again sometime soon. And I agree that we have not gotten to talk nearly as much history in the last few months as we usually do. And I'm happy to finally get the chance to do it. We had mentioned earlier about some pictures that I forgot to show in my opening. And I can use those, I think, as a teaser. So let me see if I can manage to handle the technology here. Go. Give me 1 second. There we go. Now it should work. As far as our opening this season, our board of directors decided earlier this month that unfortunately we just wouldn't be able to do it for this season. The constraints that we would have would not make it a conducive tour for either our volunteers or for our visitors. So we're going to remain closed throughout the rest of 2020. However, we are going to work on trying to have some outdoor opportunities. We have a mile-long walking tour that takes about 2 hours, and it talks about the escape of Booth and Harold off of our property and the manhunt. We're actually going to offer one of those this Saturday if you were in the area, 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock. We're not, because the museum is not open and the building won't be accessible to anybody, we're not charging anything. We're just asking if you like what you hear to give a donation, since we've taken a hurting financially this year, not being able to open, but we want to get out and bring some people to the site and have a little bit of fun. So you can look for some information on our webpage. It's drmud.org. It's drmud2ds.org. And we have several social media outlets. Facebook is our primary outlet. Twitter and Instagram, they are all at Dr. Mud House, at Dr. Mud House. You can follow us there and get all kinds of history and updates. But I do want to tease you a little bit and show you kind of the hot spots on our site. So obviously you're looking at the front of the house in a much colder winter scene in February. That's the front door where Booth and Harold showed up the night of the assassination, or the morning after the assassination. And probably our most talked about piece is the one that you can see in the middle of the room here. That is the actual couch that Dr. Mudd brought John Wilkes Booth in on, sat him down, and started his examination. It stayed in the family for years. It was donated back to the museum in the 1980s, and now it is our piece de resistance. It is the one thing that everybody wants to see, sitting exactly where it was in 1865, when our most infamous guest took a short rest on it. And then very quickly, within a matter of a few minutes, Dr. Mudd realized that Booth's leg needed more attention than he was going to be able to give it quickly. So he moved him to an upstairs bedroom that was outfitted with 2 beds. This is our representation of it in modern times. There were 2 beds in the room. Not exactly sure where they were placed or how they were placed, but there is a picture that was taken in the 1880s that has the room configured this way. So that's what we base it off of. This is where the infamous boot is going to be left behind, and that is the piece of corroborating evidence that really makes Dr. Mudd a suspicious character in the eyes of the federal officers who come to arrest him. And whenever we can see you again in 2021, we'll be more than happy to take you through and show you all of the many other sites in the house. We're incredibly lucky that we have a very large number of family pieces that are still in the house, and you'll get to see those. There are things that Dr. Mudd made in Fort Jefferson while he was in prison that are on display there, family heirlooms. We even have a few things from Ned Spangler, the stagehand at Ford's Theater, who was arrested and sentenced to prison. He actually, a lot of people don't know this, he moved in with the Mudds for the last 18 months of his life. He died in one of the upstairs rooms there. And if you are just itching to get into the Mud House this year, but you can't, when you go to our website, we did create a 3-dimensional virtual tour that you can click on the screen. You can look all around the room, and then some of those artifacts that I just mentioned actually have little expanders on them where you can click on them and learn about the artifacts. So once again, thank you all very much.
Awesome. And Bob, Kobe, and Jeff, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. This has been awesome. I think all our viewers will have enjoyed this, and I hope this is something that can become a regular gathering together and interpretation of the assassination attempt. Someone already mentioned Manhunt, which is going to be the go-to book I pointed our viewers to if they're interested in learning about the assassination attempt. If you're interested in taking a more Seward-centric dive into April 14th, Betty Owensby's Alias Payne, which is the biography on Lewis Powell, is absolutely phenomenal. Really paints a kind of complicated portrait of this complicated figure, where he falls into the broader conspiracy, and kind of, I think, a recurring theme that we've all been talking about today. After you read it, you're just left with so many more questions that you want answers to. So that would be the book I would point everyone in the direction to, along with Manhunt. For anyone interested in visiting the Seward House Museum, we are open back to the public, though at a limited tour schedule. So if you visit sewardhouse.org, you can see what time tours are running, and you can also pre-register for those tours. Similarly, if you're interested in stories like the assassination attempt, which is really a unique and interesting story, I might point you in the direction of our Haunted History tours, which will be starting, I believe, the 3rd weekend in October and running throughout the rest of the month, every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. You can find information about those tours on our website, on the events calendar. But thank you, folks, for visiting or viewing this digitally. We hope you enjoyed the talk, and have a good day.